Welcome CIS 1400 to another module. This will be the last one before your next project. I'll introduce this next project in this week's module, but it won't be due until the end of next week. But in this project and for this module, you're going to have to be able to do some file processing as well as some object-oriented design. So I thought we would first talk about some file processing and how to access and information from a plain text file or a binary file. So if you haven't had a chance to read the chapter on file processing yet, I do believe it's chapter 10 in the text, please make sure that you do that first and foremost so that what we're about to go through kind of makes sense logically. We're going to go through kind of the Python specifics for it so you can work it into your next project. Okay? So let's get into this and kind of present here. So file processing is actually pretty simple in Python. They have a lot of built-in methods that kind of help you out with the ins and outs of it. When it comes to writing a file and reading a file, it basically requires three steps. You first have to open a stream to the file, okay? You have to make sure that you can read and write to the file, and third, you have to always close the stream to the file. If you don't close it, then you might open yourself up to corrupting the data inside, or being able, or writing to it when you don't mean to, or something of that nature. So you got to make sure that you always close what you open here. Python does make it pretty easy to do with some built-in methods. The open method, for instance, is a built-in method just like length or print or min or max or any of those. When you type open, what it does, it opens a file for you, and close will close a file for you. Now when you open a file, you can open it in different modes, and that's kind of what I have written down here. These different modes are read, write, append, R+, W+, and A+. And what the pluses mean is it kind of opens the file up in both a read-write mode. Now there are some subtle differences to when you would choose R+ versus W+ versus A+. It kind of all comes down to what you want to deal with it. My suggestion is, especially for these projects that you're about to do, only open stuff up in read mode, write mode, or append mode. Don't do the R+, W+, or A+ options. Because you're going to want to have to read in the file, and then do some processing, and then you'll write to the file afterwards. You don't need to do both at the same time. But making sure that you understand when it happens and why it happens, we got a nice little flow chart here to kind of walk you through what you would choose and when. So let's say you're working on opening a file and you want to know what you're opening the file for. Well, if you're opening it just for reading purposes, the attribute you want to work with is just the R, being able to read it. It'll put the cursor, per se, the pointer, at the initial position at the very top of the text file or whatever it is file you're working with, so that you can read from the top down. Okay. If you want to just write to the file, okay, it depends on whether or not you want to squash whatever file was there, or if you want to add to it. Now, if you just want to completely overwrite the file, use the W attribute. If you'd like to add to the end of the file, use the A attribute, so to append to it. If you are reading from a file and the file doesn't exist, Python will throw a fit and argue with you. If you're writing to a file and the file doesn't exist, it will create the file for you. If you're attempting to append to a file that doesn't exist, again, it will kind of argue with you. So this is mainly where we're going to stick in the R, W, and A attributes for opening a file. However, if you ever get more adventurous and you want to be able to read and write to a file all in kind of the same steps, you do have to decide whether or not you want to add to the file, start your cursor at the beginning of the file, or if you want to completely squash, again, the file that was there and work with it. So it really comes down to whether or not you want to truncate or overwrite the file. If the answer is yes, then W+ is your option. But if you don't want to completely overwrite the file and you'd like to be able to read and write from it, you would use either the R+ or the A+ option. It just depends on where you'd like the cursor to kind of begin. If you'd like to have your pointer begin at the very beginning of the file, choose the R+ method or attribute, and if you'd like it to start at the end of the file, use the A+ attribute. So let's kind of look at some of these methods in readit.py. I've had some pre-made Python programs. In this program, you're going to see a couple methods get used. You're going to see the read method, the read line method, and the read lines method. They're all pretty simple to do. Read will read some quantity of data and return it as a string. So the size attribute will tell us how many characters we'd like to point at throughout this file and read in. So it's an optional argument. If you provide it, say a 5 or something like that, it'll read in 5 characters from the text file. If you don't provide it with an argument at all, it'll read the entire contents of the file and place it into whatever assignment you have it going into. The read line method will read a single line from the text file all the way until it finds a new line character. If the size argument is done, it will dictate how many characters to read from whatever that current line. So it doesn't tell us the size is often confused saying I want to read X number of lines. That's really not what the case is. It tells you how many characters you'd like to read from the current line and only the current line. Read lines will read in all the lines of a file, but the nice thing about read lines is it actually returns an entire list in which every element of the list is a single line from the text file. Okay, so now that you've got that list that you can have with all of the contents of it, you can process it pretty easily. So let's kind of cut over and see what this readit.py looks like and go from there. So readit.py is right here, and readit.py works with the readit.txt file. So let's open that and just kind of see what it is. The txt file is pretty simple. It has 3 lines of text. The first line says line 1, the second line says this is line 2, and the third line says that makes this line 3. So the actual file itself demonstrates how to use all of those methods. So I'm going to run it, and then we'll talk about the output as compared to what's happening in the process of the program at the same time. So if I run it, you're going to see a lot of stuff gets printed, but let's just kind of go through it little bit by little bit. Lines 4 through 6. Okay, this illustrates that we can open a text file in read-only mode. Notice the attribute, the R's, W's, A's, R plus, W plus, A plus. They're still just strings that you're passing in, so you got to hold them in quotes. And then I have the file path or the file name for the file that I'd like to read. Now the only reason I can keep it this short is because the readit.txt and my readit.py are in the exact same directory or the same folder. If it was in any place else, I would need an absolute file path or a relative file path that would allow me to get there. So you'll have to make sure that you can work with that accordingly. Now I'm going to suggest, for our purposes, keep whatever files you're going to be processing in the same place as the current Python program you're working with, just to make it simple enough, and pass it in as a string like this. Don't forget the extension here, .txt or whatever the extension may be. So here's the idea. We've got our open method. It's a built-in method. It requires 2 arguments. The arguments are a file path and some sort of mode to read or write to this file. Here we want to read from it, so there we go. And then I have the text file being closed. So here's me closing the object that I created. So the open method will create a file object, and it will store it in this variable, and then I can act upon it like textfile.close. And so that's what this very first line of text is right here, opening and closing the file. There's the first print statement, and these are the 2 things that it's doing. Okay. So let's look at this next chunk right here. Reading in characters from the file. You can see it prints an L and it prints INE space 1. So why is it doing that? Well, here's that first print statement, reading in the characters from the file. I open the text file, readit.txt. Now I have to open it again because I closed it previously, so the stream was closed, so I got to open it up. Now this shows the read method getting used. I have print text file.read1, and so here is a single character, and print.textfile read5. Notice that it brings in 5 characters, 1, 2, 3, 4 with the space, 5. But it starts where this one left off. So every time you read from a file, there's kind of this imaginary cursor, what we'll call a pointer, that will point at a character and give it back to us. And then once it's done, it moves on to the next one. It kind of maintains its place as it's going all through. So you'll see that the read method, pretty simple. When you pass in a single integer, it'll read in a specific number of characters from the text file. So read of 1, prints out a single character, read of 5, prints out 5 characters, but it will print out the 5 from the first because we've already read in the first. And here I close the file, and now my stream is closed for that particular chunk. Let's look at the next little bit down here. Reading the entire file all at once, so these 3 parts. That happens here. Here we've got the print statement that says reading the entire file all at once. I open the text file, same way I did before. I have a variable here called whole thing, and it's textfile.read. Notice no argument is being passed in here. And so when it does that, it actually reads in the entire file and stores it all in this one variable. And so if I print that entire variable, it prints every line of text. Line 1, this is line 2, that makes this line 3. And I close the file. So if you ever want to bring in the whole thing, if it's short enough and small enough, you absolutely can do that with just a simple read method. Okay. The next chunk, reading characters from a line, I've got L and INE1 again. So this will show us how the read line method works when we pass in an argument. It works very, very similar to the read method. So here's the characters coming in line by line, textfile.open, print textfile.read line of 1. Here's one character from the first line. Print text file read line of 5. Here's the next 5 characters from there. Now, if I were to say open that up to 9, okay, let's see what happens and run it again. Okay, we'll come back in and reading characters from a line. You'll notice that when I passed in a 9, it didn't actually progress into the next line. Okay. So it'll only work on that current line of code. If I give it a value that's too big, it'll just read in as much as it can, and that's about it. So that's where the read line method comes in versus the read method. Had I passed in like a 9 to the read method, it would read in as many characters as it can and go to the next line if it could. Okay. The next chunk is reading one line at a time. Okay, reading characters from a line, reading characters one line at a time. So here's the print statement that's making this right here. Now in this one, I'm doing opening the file, and I'm printing a read line with no argument, so it's going to read an entire line, and then I did it again, and I did it again, and you can see that it reads in a line, reads in a line, reads in a line. Now the question always begs, why are we getting these extra spaces here? Well, when I read in a line from a text file, even though you can't see it in the text file, there's these imaginary characters that are telling the cursor to move down here. And there's those /n's that we used to put in our print statements. And so when I read in the line, that /n is coming in and it's moving the cursor down already. And the print function also moves the cursor down, which is kind of why I'm getting the double spacing here. Okay, so the read line is giving me the /n, which is bringing the cursor down. The print statement, once it's finished printing out the line, also gives me a space, and so that's why I kind of get this double spacing in here, right? So you can kind of see how that's all working. And then I close the text file. I can kind of prove that to you if I did something like that, end equals, and then put a space there. You'll notice that this particular gap now leaves, but I still get it on 2 lines, even though this particular attribute should say, hey, let's keep the cursor where it is and print the next line of code where it needs to be. So if I come in and read it, you're going to see that right here, this is line 2, comes up here, and now the extra space came in because I did get the new line character, and I put in an extra space because that's what this does. So I put in that extra space. So you can kind of see that the read line will bring in everything, even the end of line character, something you need to be mindful of. Okay. Read lines. Okay, you're going to notice how this kind of works, and we'll see it in a couple different instances here. So this kind of prints a few things. So if I read an entire file into a list, so here's the chunk down here that we have, and the print statement associated with it, we opened it. I have my text file.readLines method getting called. It's getting set into a variable called lines. Now if I print lines, you can see that it prints out a list containing all of the lines of text. And in this instance, you can actually see the /n characters that you couldn't necessarily see in the text file. It actually captures them and prints them out. So that might be something you need to process and take care of if you don't want those little pieces. I can print the length of the lines. Since lines is an array or a list, it has 3 elements, 1, 2, 3. I can iterate over lines, printing out a single line. So here's line 1, here's line 2, here's line 3. Again, kind of getting the double spacing because we got those end of line character, the /n's, those new line characters, plus the print statement. And then I simply close it, okay? And the last thing is just looping through a text file kind of one line at a time. Easy enough to do. So I've got the open method, open up the text file, 4-line in text file. Text file is a file, but it's iterable. Okay, it's a sequence that I can go through, and I can print out a line at a time, and it will loop through the file line by line. Since it is just text, it's a sequence of characters. We can read over it just pretty easily. So reading in a text file isn't all that hard. You've got lots of methods to choose from. You just have to choose the one that's most appropriate for you. I find that read lines is very useful, especially when you just want to slam stuff into a list really quickly. But if you are just looking for things one line at a time or a certain number of characters at a time, depending on how your file is set up, the other methods can be very appropriate as well. All right. So write it .py. So if you can read from a text file, you better be able to write to a text file. Writing to a text file is even simpler than reading from a text file. You have the ability to write certain contents, okay, pass it a string, whoops, and you can write whatever you pass in to the text file, and it'll write those characters, or you can write a full line, okay, and what you can pass it then is a list, and it'll write all the contents of the list to a file. So if you've got an entire list that you'd like to write to the file, you can absolutely do that with the write line method instead of just the write method. So let's kind of take a look at that Python program and see how it works. So here's write-it.py. So it sets up pretty much the same as before. Okay. So if I want to write something, I still use the open function. Actually, let's just run this so you can see how it's working. Okay. Now write-it.py has some output because I not only write, but I also read. So write-it.py will allow us to open a text file called write-it.txt. Now since I ran it, write-it.txt was created if it wasn't made before. So you can see if I delete this file, right, completely, refractor, okay, and then I run this again. Notice I do not have write-it.txt anywhere in here, but if I run this file, it will create it for me, right? It should pop up here in a second, and I can prove that it's actually working for me because it actually read in all that information, okay? So stop that for a sec, and you can see write-it.txt shows up. So let me run it one more time so we can see it without any issues. And what's happening here is we use the open method again. We pass it a file name that we'd like to call it. If it doesn't exist, it'll make it. If it does exist, it'll overwrite its contents. But we put it in write mode. And then there are different methods that we can use, like write, okay? And if I use the write method, I pass it a string, like line 1. This is line 2. That makes this line 3. And you'll notice that in write-it.txt, it says line 1, this is line 2, that makes this line 3. Now these other lines come in a little bit further down in the program, so don't worry about those. So I open the file, and I can read it in, and I can print it. So this is what's happening here. So I created the text files with the write method, reading the newly created file, line 1, line 2, this makes line 3. And then I close the file. Now I create files with the write lines method. So I do textfile.open, and here instead of doing a straight write, I did an append here. So you'll notice that this is where the extra pieces come in. I've got this list called lines. It has the same text as before, but it's in a list instead. And I do textfile.write of lines and close it. And so when that particular module runs, that block of code runs, you can see this is where the other pieces are coming from. Okay? And so that when I print it and see it, creating a text file with lines, now I've got all of these other pieces. These didn't exist, those last 3 pieces didn't exist prior to this here. So that's why when we read, we only get 3 lines of text because that's all that's there. But when I finally open the file again in append mode, it puts the pointer at the very end of it, and then I'm able to add these particular pieces in, and then I can write them in and essentially read them in as well. So writing to a text file, super simple to do. You really only have 2 methods to worry about, write and write lines. Right? If you're going to write something, it's going to be a string that you're going to write to. If write lines, pass it a list of strings of information that you'd like it to write, and it'll write those lists in. Right? Now, sometimes your data isn't as simple as just basic text. You can get a lot done with just text, and text files are very easy to process. But sometimes you want to store some things that are a little bit more complex, okay? And so in the reading that you did, you probably learned or read about a binary file. Python, again, gives us the ability to read and write binary files pretty easily. It uses what we call a pickle module. Okay, so it's not a built-in function per se, but it's something we can access very easily, and it comes pre-installed with Python, with every Python distribution. Okay, so pickling is exactly what it means. It's a preservation tool for more complex information, but in order to use it, you have to import the pickle module. So let's get in with a data file, not a text file, to help us out with a binary piece and see how it goes. So here's what we're going to do. In Picklet.py, we're going to show you how we can open information, but we don't do R, W, and A. We do R, B, W, B, and A, B. Okay? The B stands for binary, so we can read to a binary file. If it doesn't exist, Python will complain with an error. We can write to a binary file. Okay? If the file exists, it'll be overwritten. If it doesn't exist, it's created, and we can append to a binary file. The same things applies with the RB+, WB+, and AB+, meaning we can read and write. It's all about cursor placement at that point in time, what you would choose to use. But we're probably going to stick mostly with the read binary and write binary and possibly append binary as we get into it. Okay? So the methods you need to worry about for pickling are pretty simple. To pickle something, to actually write it to a file, what we do is we dump the information into a file. Okay? Now the dump method requires two pieces of information, an object that we'd like to dump and the file in which we want to dump it to. So remember, we're not opening a file here, so there's no stream already created, but the pickle module creates that stream when we start to place stuff in or pull stuff out. Okay? You can actually pickle a lot of different things. Numbers, strings, tuples, lists, dictionaries, and objects. We're going to more worry about objects and lists in this case. And the second thing that you can do from the pickle module that we'll be working with is load. And if you load, you pass it in a file name, and the load method will read in and return one pickled object at a time from the file defined by the argument. Okay, so it unpickles it and brings it in. So let's take a look at how that kind of works and look at picklet.py. Okay, so first the data in picklet.py. You can see the data in this. Okay, it looks very unreadable. Okay, because it's in binary format, and actually that's more readable than it needs to be. Don't worry about the shelf module, but we're going to import pickle. That's the first thing you need to do. And what I'd like to do is work with this. So let's run it and kind of see what happens. So here I've got pickling lists, so I'm just going to do some lists to be very simple. The lists are variety, shape, and brand. Variety has three text string objects associated with it. Shape, 3 string objects, and brand, again, 3 string objects associated with that list. And so we're going to use the open method, but we're going to open something called pickle1.dat. So it's a data file, but we're going to open it in a write binary mode. And then what I need to do is put stuff into this file, okay? So to do that, I have to access the dump method from the pickle module. So I say pickle.dump, and we've done this before with, say, randoms. We do random.randint or random.randrange. So anytime you import a module to gain access to its methods, you have to use the module name followed by a dot and the method you'd like to use. Now the method we're going to use requires 2 arguments. First, what we want to put in there, and second, where we want to put it. Now F stands for the file that we opened that we'd like to put it in. So we have the file open, a stream is created. Now we can put variety into F by dumping it there. We can put shape into F by dumping it there, and brand into F by dumping it there, and then essentially we can close the file. So this right here is what gives me pickle1.dat, and it gives me all of this stuff in this file. Now if I want to read it and unpickle the list, okay, bring it out so that I can do something with it, it's again pretty simple. We open the file, but we open it in a write or read binary mode, call it F or whatever you want, and then the load function will allow us to bring in an entire object from the file one at a time. So the first thing that we wrote in there was the variety, so it might be the first thing that I would unshelve. Okay, so if I do pickle.load of f, variety is what comes out. Pickle.load of f again is now the shape that what comes out, is because that's the second thing I dumped in there. And pickle.load f is the brand that comes out. And so if I print the variety, shape, and brand, we get exactly the list that we had originally. And again, I close it. So to be perfectly honest with you, file processing in Python, it doesn't get a whole lot simpler, and in many other languages, it's a far more complicated process than it probably needs to be. If it's meant to be simple, Python's got a simple way of doing it. So the trick is, you really just need to kind of identify what kind of file are you working with. A sequential access file, like a text file, or a binary file, something you can access sequentially or maybe randomly. Okay, in this case, in this class, we're going to deal with sequential access for the most part. But it all kind of comes down to what you want to store. If you want to store just plain text and easy stuff, a text file is definitely the way to go. You've got some more flexibility there in how you can access the information. But if you've got more complex information, pickling is definitely what you want to be doing, because you can put that complex information into a file very, very easily. Okay, just make sure you name it accordingly. So file access, pretty simple to work with. We're going to write a project in the next video to kind of show us some more object-oriented features and to use some file processing as we want to go, just to make sure you're prepared for your next project, the bank account project, as we get into it. So hopefully that all kind of makes sense a little bit. I would invite you, and I'll post some links in the overview for the module for where you can get some more reference material on opening and working with files in Python. So feel free to please read those and get an understanding of it. If you have any trouble doing that in this project that I'm going to give you, please make sure that you ask about it, and don't wait till the last minute on this project, because it is a large project and it's worth 200 of the 1,000 points in the course. So it's something you're going to want to be working on over these next 2 weeks. So please take some time to do so, and we're going to put in some checkpoints there for what I'd like to see as we go. So hopefully that all works out for you. Again, if there's any questions, post them in the discussion thread in the module. And yeah, we'll catch you in the next video.